There's a very valuable lesson that we need to understand about our current world situation. And when I say world, I mean world, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. There is a problem going on that the scriptures speak to that I need to address today. It's going to feel a little bit like a political lecture. I'm just warning you in advance because we do have some policies in place right now that are going to lead to more and more slavery. And so what is that? I'm going to ask you to engage with me. Let's go back to the book of Genesis. I want to talk a little bit about the Egyptian pharaohs. Man, you talk about a country that went for a long time. We talk about the Roman Empire, how that went a long time. Like the Egyptian nation, that region there, the pharaohs that ruled over Egypt, they spanned over 3,000 years. And there's a reason why Egypt in early world history, just about as far back as we can go, written history, what we understand that there's a reason why they prospered. It's very similar to why we prosper here in the United States. Okay? First of all, we've got some natural geographic insulation from attacking armies here in the United States. We've got an ocean to the east and to the west. You're not coming in from the north a lot of times. It's going to be too cold. There's just this little isthmus to the south of us. So we're protected there. Plus, we have all these natural resources that have been made available to us. We've got rivers and streams going everywhere. We've got land that can be easily cultivated. That's what the Egyptian nation had back in the day. The Nile River would flood every year. It would irrigate the Nile River Valley. They were the first people to develop irrigation systems to run out to people who owned private land, and they could farm, and they were just an incredibly prosperous nation. They didn't have democracy as we know it today, but they did have dynasties, which were family and people groups, like a select group of nobles who would elect leaders who would administrate the working together of the country. They weren't necessarily, the pharaohs early on weren't necessarily dictators. When we were talking about 1,000 years before Abraham, up until the time of Abraham, they were more similar to, up until the time of Abraham, all the way to the time of Joseph, they were more similar to what we would have as mayors. I mean, if you ever see like Mayor McFarland or like, ooh, I'm scared of him. Did anybody feel that way? No, like, oh, there's, you know, like none of us feel that way. We don't bow down when the mayor's coming. The pharaohs were administrators of the people groups, of the nation. They helped maintain the army, but they weren't being attacked that much. They oversaw that region, most prosperous region of the world, and they were appointed by a certain number of noble families, the nobility in the day, okay? Now, 1,000 years go by, and then we make it to the time of Joseph. And there was a Pharaoh who had a dream. We've studied this, so I'm not going to go back through all of that. But he had a dream that there was going to be 7 years of plenty and then followed by 7 years of famine. We've already done all that, so I'm not going to go against that. But I want you to see what Joseph did here. When he said, okay, here's what's coming. God's told us what's going to happen. 7 good years followed by 7 bad years. He said, let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. In other words, they're going to tax people 20% of their grain, their income. That's going to go to Pharaoh. Watch what he says. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities. That's where they're going to store it, in the cities, because that's where a lot of the population is. So all the stuff that they're raising out in rural areas, they're going to bring all that money into the cities, and it'll be under Pharaoh's watchful eye. And that food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Okay, so like we saw, you got 7 years of plenty to come, and they're taking 20% of everybody. Now, why are they having to take 20%? Can you imagine this, that if a politician would run today and say, right now I'm taxing you at 2 or 3%, but I've got to raise your taxes to 20% a year on top of what you're already paying. So a lot of us would be like, well, why are you going to do that? And then he says, because I had a dream. And I had this Jewish guy interpret it for me, and he's come up with this plan, so all of you just need to give me my money. So you can see where a lot of the nobility and the people, all the private landowners all around would have said, man, I don't know about this giving you 20% of all my crops that come in, but you know what? I mean, we'll do it. We'll do it for 7 years. We'll agree to do this for 7 years, and we'll just see if this famine hits. We'll see how this goes, okay? Now, watch what happens in Genesis 47. I can't tell you how important this is. But college students, man, I'm so glad y'all are here today. High school students, put this in the back of your mind. Remember this sermon for the rest of your life. Now, there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, just like the dream said, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. That's up where Joseph's extended family lived, up in Canaan land. And Joseph gathered up, watch, all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they had bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Now, I want you to catch what just happened here. All this grain that they had, he's saying that he's collecting everybody's money. It's famine year. People don't have food. So everybody has to come to the government to get the grain. My question to you is, how did they get the grain in the first place? It was the people's grain. Do you understand that? In other words, I take 20% of all your income, and then when you come back to me, now you have to pay me to give that money back to you. And if I were them, I'm like, no, wait a minute. That's my grain you took, and now in order to get the services that we provided to you, now we got to pay you to provide those services back to us? Those services belong to us. It's our money. But they did it. And now Pharaoh, instead of that money being spread out over all the millions of people that lived in Egypt, now Pharaoh is the richest man by far, okay? And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. Why is their money gone? Because he's given them the grain. This is only in year 2. So Joseph answered, well, give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. Okay, you're out of money. Now you're going to have to give me all your animals. And then I will give you Pharaoh's grain. But remember, it's not Pharaoh's grain, is it? How did Pharaoh get the grain? It's their grain. And now he's selling it back to them. And so they brought in their livestock to Joseph. And Joseph gave them food in exchange for, in other words, he gave them back their food that belonged to them in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. And he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So now they've given you all the money that they had in savings. They've given it just to survive, to eat year 1. Year 2, now you've got all our animals and everything we need to farm the land that we still own. What do they have left? And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said, we will not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent. The herds of the livestock are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. In other words, oh, please, please, pretty please, will you give us back the grain that you told us you needed from us 10 years ago so that we will not die? And we will be willing to be Pharaoh's slaves, and now Pharaoh can own all the land, even a smaller percentage. It'll be Pharaoh and just his select group of 100 people that he's related to. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was so severe on them, and the land became Pharaoh's. This, my friend, is how you get dictators. This is how you have despotism. Now he controls the army. He controls all the land. He's the number 1 landowner in all of Egypt. He controls the armies. He controls the banks. He controls everything. This is what happened in the days of Joseph. Now, as for the people, he made servants of them And now I'm going to show you something in your Bible. If you're following along, some of you might have a King James Bible, a New King James Bible, or a New American Standard. There are other versions of this. And then some of you have different versions. And forgive me if this sounds a little seminary-esque here, but I've got to explain it when you see a difference in the text. There are very few places in the Bible where you've got, what does that mean? And the word is completely different. This is one of them. There's a debate about which the original text read. But here's the deal. The meaning is the same. It doesn't affect the meaning. One of them it says, so Joseph the Pharaoh had all the people move to the cities so they could work there while they were in the cities. Why were they all moving to the cities? That's a question. Why did everybody have to move to the cities? Because that's where what was? That's where the food was. That's where the handouts were, is in the cities. So now people have left all the land that they've sold out in the rural areas, and the population of the cities are increasing, but the population of the land, of the people working the land, that's decreasing. And ultimately, that leads to people being made servants. That's what happens, because when everybody moves to a city, then the people who are already in the city who own the land, what are they going to do for those people? Are they going to sell their land to the people? No, Pharaoh already owns that land. So everybody moving to the city, not only do they have to work for Pharaoh, but they're also going to have to pay him what to live on his land? It's a 4-letter word, starts with R. Rent. So every month, instead of them owning house or making a mortgage payment, now they're paying rent. And at the end of 20 years of paying rent to Pharaoh, who's still going to own that land? The answer is what? Who? Pharaoh's still going to own it. So they're not building any wealth on their own. They're just living hand to mouth, eating the food that the government's giving them, the handouts. And they're happy to keep paying that rent to the Pharaoh, to the government, from one end of Egypt to the other. Now, only the land of the priests he did not buy. For the priest had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and they lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Now, the priests were the ones who were entrusted with proclaiming to the government and to the people what the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. But here's the thing. Watch. Are the priests ever going to stand up to the government if the government is giving them their salary? The answer to that's what? No, this is why you never mix politics and religion. You can never have the government having control over your religion. The government's policies are informed by your religious standards, but you don't inform your religious standards according to what the government tells you to do. It will always end, that policy will always end in slavery for the people, because governments will always enforce their power unless the people speaking on behalf of the people and of God and the justice of God speak truth to the people in high places. Are you tracking me so far? We can never be answerable to the government. This is why ultimately the people lost their power. Now Joseph says to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And if I were there, I would say, well, isn't that nice of you, Mr. Joseph? Now you have everything that I have. And at the harvest, he says, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. I'll give you food. I tell you what, of everything you make, I'll let you keep 80% of it. But 20% is going to belong to me. Do you catch this, what happened here? When the rules were first instituted, hey, we're going to tax you at 20%. How long did they say they were going to tax him 20%? For 7 years. Now what's he saying? I'm even going to tax you 20% when you're slaves. From now on, you pay 20% even when you're dirt poor, even though you don't have any land of your own. What little bit you have, you're still going to give me 20%. And they said, This is the slave mentality. You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord. We will be servants to Pharaoh. Oh, thank you, sir. Do you not realize what the government just did to you? And you let them do it. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt. Watch this. Moses is writing this 400 years later. And it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So as long as the priests stay silent for the next 400 years, we'll still let you have your land, but you just stay in your place. You just stay in your lane over there, but don't speak to our policies that lead to slavery. And how long are they going to keep paying 20%? Forever. In other words, there was a time, did you know, in our country when the federal income tax was just 1%? How many of you can remember that? The answer is none of you, because it was so long ago. It just keeps going up and up. And every once in a while, they'll ratchet back down, but then it goes back up. Because this is what happened. When political entities give power, they tend not to give it back. And thus, Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. Now watch this. These are Joseph's people. And they gained possessions in it. And they were fruitful. And they were multiplied greatly. Like Joseph said, we're not going to go into debt like the Egyptians did. I'm going to make sure you have food. I'm going to make sure you have grain. We're not going to be going over here to Pharaoh with our hat in our hand. I'm going to take care of you and my people. I'm going to take care of me and mine. And listen, that worked as long as Joseph was alive. But then Joseph died, and the tide changes. Now, why is this so important? Listen. Here it is. The people of Egypt, go in the book of Exodus. The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied, grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This is like 50, 100 years after Joseph died. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many, and they're too mighty for us. We got all these immigrants living here among us. This is what dictators do. This is what we call despotism. They start vilifying people that don't look like them, don't act like them, didn't grow up like they did, don't worship like they do, different skin colors. You start looking at a people group over here, and this is what the Jewish people missed. Even though they were taking care and doing things God's way on their own, and they were okay, this is what happens every time. If you're a minority of people and you've got money and you're being taken care of, eventually the subjugated class is going to look at you and say, there's more of us than there are them. We're going to come and take what you got, because it ain't fair that you got what you got and we ain't got what we ain't got. And that's what this new Pharaoh is doing. It isn't right that these people are prospering and we're doing this over here. We got to do something about all these, way too many immigrants running in here around us. We got to do something about them. He says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more the Jews were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. And this is how, in one generation, the Jewish people went from being prosperous to the slaves of Egypt. Why? Because the government with the power that owns all the land can always subjugate those who are in the minority and do not have the power. And they made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And at all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Enter Moses. So Moses comes in after they've been slaves for hundreds of years, and he says to Pharaoh, let my people go. We're not going to serve in this system anymore. He's speaking truth to power. And because he has the might of God behind him and the sovereign hand of God behind him, God's people are set free. And then he sets God's law before the people, laws for human flourishing. One of it is, if we're going to take the names of the Lord, the Ten Commandments, you've heard of these, right in the middle of the Ten Commandments, like, hey, if you're going to call yourself a follower of God, don't take it in vain. Don't misuse God's name, okay? And then he goes to, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, the Jews have been working all week long. They never got a day off. But he instituted, watch this, labor laws, saying you can't take advantage of those who could easily be taken advantage of. To remind the people that even though they might work for 6 days, ultimately their worth is not in what their hands produce, but in the God that they worship and the image of God that has been impressed upon their soul. This is at the heart of all human dignity. And you don't have more value if you're an American or a Russian or a member of the Chinese. Like, we're all created in the image of God. Y'all tracking with me so far? And you got to have that day off, he says. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day, it's a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who's within your gates. Even the illegal aliens that are there, is what he's saying. You shall count. Now, before I go on, I want to tell you what Torah is saying here. Moses is setting up laws. He's setting up governmental policies. He's speaking to politics here. He's saying, listen, if we don't figure out ways to keep our people out of debt, eventually if the majority of people aren't landowners, the rich will end up enslaving the poor. Then the people's worth will be determined by what they produce instead of who they are. And this is why Moses also codified this law. And we don't talk about it much in churches today, and we don't talk much about it in the United States, and they didn't even talk much about it in the time of Moses. Watch what he says. He says, you shall count 7 weeks of years. That's 7 sevens. Remember that. We'll come back to it later in the book of Daniel. 7 sevens of years. In other words, 7 times 7 years. That's 49 years. It's not hard math, right? So that the time of 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Watch. And in that 50th year, you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all of your land, okay? The Jewish year, Day of Atonement has been this month, okay? And then he says, you shall consecrate, set aside the 50th year, put it in your laws, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. And in that 50th year, watch this, the year of Jubilee, every 50 years with the year of Jubilee, was when all credit card debt was canceled. All student loans were canceled. All debt that anybody had at all canceled, and whatever land you sold, your family sold over the last 50 years because maybe things didn't go your way or maybe you were just stupid, that land reverted back to its original owners, okay? So what that means is if I've got land and I sell that land, I'm going to eventually get that land back. Now imagine if I'm running a bank and Max, you come to me in year 48. I'm not going to give you a 30-year loan because I know according to the law, Jewish law, Torah, in 2 years, I got to cancel all your debts. So am I going to give you a $50,000 loan if I know you can't pay it back in 2 years? No, I'm not going to do that. Am I going to get you in a bunch of debt that I know you're not going to pay back? No, I'm not going to allow you to get yourself in a situation where ultimately I know I'm going to lose. You're not going to pay me that back. So I can't let you get in that kind of debt. This is what they set up there because Moses understood. I'll say it again. The key to having a free and prosperous people is that people have to have access to land ownership. Now, I say that to say, any history students in here who have seen this verse before? Any of you recognize this verse and where's it from? It's enshrined in something very important in American history. It made a lot of noise, especially when the bullet hit it and cracked it. Any of you ever been to Philadelphia and seen the Liberty Bell? This is the verse that's on it. Why, of all the verses, when it came to the American Revolution, did they talk about this verse? Because our founding fathers understood that which King George was taking away from them is the freedom more and more to have personal property. Did you know the original version that a guy named Patrick Henry, when he said, give me liberty or give me death, when they were working, the guys from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson was writing in the Declaration of Independence, James Madison, another Virginia guy. When they're writing this and they're saying, we got to have liberty, they say the most fundamental human rights, fill in the blanks for me, you ready? Are life, liberty, and what? The pursuit of happiness. That's what we all know. That's what eventually went in there. But watch. Somebody down here said it right. You know your history, thank God. What was originally in there that Patrick Henry said had to be in there, Thomas Jefferson had in there, was life, unalienable rights, life, liberty, and what? Property. Because our founding fathers said if we're going to be a free people, people have to have access to own their own land. That's how they build wealth. Otherwise, they're always renting and paying the man the money, and then the man will take that money and just buy up more and more land, and the poor would just get poorer and poorer, and the borrower will be servant to the lender. If we're going to have freedom in this country, everybody's got to have a right to life, liberty, and property. That's how they pursue happiness. But they dropped it, that idea of property for everybody. You know why? Because there were two groups of people, they were saying, we don't want to own property. Because all these property owners didn't want to share, even though they wanted freedom from King George. There was one group of people, they didn't want to have property, and they were called women. It's half the population. Women couldn't own property in many of the what would be colonies, okay? And then the other is blacks, the slave class, the people that they were farming their property that they had, that they wanted freedom from King George. So this is what was going on at the time. Like, follow me here. It's going to all come together here in just a moment. What happened in the 16th, 17th century, okay? You had all these European monarchies that owned all the land in Europe, and the people couldn't get out. And so they started looking for other options to take care of their families and posterity. I'm going to read to you from historian Gordon Woods. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote The Radicalism of the American Revolution, and this is what he notes. In Europe, land was scarce in relation to the people and therefore was expensive. Hence, unable to afford their own land to farm, Europeans were compelled to work for others, either by becoming laborers for landowners in the countryside, or more often by migrating to the cities to engage in manufacturing goods in factories. In both cases, since labor, because of its plentifulness, was cheap, the workers' wages were low. Again, what is he noting here historically? When everybody couldn't have land, where did they have to move to find work? To the city. But since all of them were working in cities, they didn't have to pay them a fair living wage, and so they would work for dirt cheap there, and also paying rent. Y'all tracking? So the people who owned all the land in the cities were getting rich not only off the cheap labor, but off the rent that the people who were giving them the cheap labor, just like the days of the Egyptians. And the American people stood up and said, no more. There comes a point when the pain of staying the same is greater, the pain of change is not as great as the pain of staying the same. So people will make changes. They will break out of uncomfortable situations, even if the costs are high, even if it costs them their life sometimes for the sake of their family. Our pilgrims that founded this country, settled here, they wanted religious freedom, listen, and land. The King of England controlled all the land, controlled the church, so they sailed west on the Mayflower. And at first they had freedom, but King George started taking that away. And this was happening in monarchies all over Europe. So they start flooding here. And as people came here, the people in Europe who didn't have the means to get here, they rebelled against their government. So you had the French Revolution, you had the American Revolution, and even the people of England rebelled against the king to the effect that they came up with something called a constitutional monarchy. And what that means was the parliament now had the power to make the decisions, and the king could sign off on it if he wanted to, but whether he did or whether he didn't, it didn't matter. They stripped him of all his true power. And that's why even today, like the king has no official power, it's just all for show. That was the eras of revolution. Now watch. After the revolution, though, the people who owned land, do you think they're going to be like the people at the time of Moses? Which, by the way, I forgot to mention this. How many times did the Jewish people, watch this, how many times in the Bible do we see the Jewish people actually following Torah and after 50 years returning all the land to the original owners? How many times do we see that in the Old Testament? How many times do we see the rich in the Old Testament forgiving all the debts of the poor every 50 years? How many times do we see that in the Bible? Do you know what the answer is? 0. They never did it. They never even gave the land a Sabbath. So over and over you see this history of the rich should give them a break, give them a chance to get out from under their debt, but they don't. And so now that they're in control, the white men are in control of the United States with their own government now, they're still profiting off of cheap labor. Where are they getting that cheap labor? From the slaves that they own. Enter the abolitionists led by pastors all over our nation who would say it is wrong in the eyes of God to enslave your brothers. No matter what somebody's skin color is, they are created with the image of God, and they also have the right to life, liberty, and should have the right to property. They should have the right. Even women should have the right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote in the Civil War, but through much bloodshed, the Africans were set free. And so now all the rich people, now that they've lost all their cheap labor, all the politicians are just sitting in Washington saying, I guess we just won't make as much money as we used to. Is that what they say? What are they going to do to get cheap labor to where they can pay people just far less than what their work is worth? They come up with this great idea. Send us your tired. Send us your poor. We're such a loving nation here. Send us your immigrants from Europe, from Eastern Europe. You're Italians, you're Irish. Just send them all over here now. And so now what do the rich have? They can't enslave the blacks anymore, so what do? They just pay slave wages to white workers from Europe. And they send them down in our coal mines. And they're working in our steel mills, in our factories, and in our cities. And while they're working literally for 20 cents an hour, this is why a lot of you, like my grandfather, who's from Pioneers, Tennessee, started out making $2 a day. And they said, well, with inflation, maybe that was a lot of money back then. What he made in a year was equivalent today buying power of $19,000 a year. Imagine trying to raise a family today on $19,000 a year. That's what we were allowing our government. Our government was allowing the oppressors to pay the workers. And the Rockefellers, the Morgans were getting rich, rich, rich. And so again, though, what happens? If you've got a select amount of people who are prospering and the masses who aren't, what are you going to have? Another rebellion. Now, this isn't a hard revolution like what you saw there. There's a soft revolution during the Industrial Revolution where we started getting labor laws, where they actually made it illegal. Just 100 years ago, did you know it was legal to pay a child 10 cents on the hour to work in a factory when he was 8 years old? How many of you had a great-grandparent that went to work in the coal mines before they were even the age of 13? Raise your hand. Do you know? Millions of people did that. My grandfather went underground when he was 12. And so what you see is the people start saying, man, we got to change the laws. We got to make sure people actually do have a day off. And a lot of you can remember people actually having a day off when you were young. How many of you my age or older know what it was like if you forgot to get milk on Saturday night? I was just a wee little one, but I just remembered if we woke up Sunday morning and we didn't have milk, what were you going to do about milk that day? The answer is what? Nothing. Why? Because no stores were open. And if your car didn't have gas, you were going to sit on Andy Griffith's porch all day long. And so something happened in the populist movement with a song from a guy from Tennessee. His name's Ernie Ford, nicknamed Tennessee Ernie Ford. And he wrote a song called 16 Tons. And it started out as a country song, but it hit the top of the charts in the pop charts. All races, everybody was related to his song of 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't come. I owe my soul to the company store. You work all day, and all the money you get goes right back to the company. You can't save up. You can't get ahead because they're always keeping you in debt. And as long as they can keep you in debt, they can work you as much as they want to. And as long as they keep working you and they're not paying you a fair wage, they know you'll never get out and you'll always have to pay them rent to live in their slum housing. Now that song hit. You start seeing laws go into effect that actually get us to treat laborers fair. And then it's gone quiet for a while. You haven't heard a whole lot of that recently until about a month ago. And this guy came along. How many of you have heard his song? Okay, a few hands. Started out on country charts, became #1 across all race, creeds, and cultures. We're seeing the effects of this today. I'm going to read you the words, but because we're in church, I'm going to edit some of them. This sounds a whole lot like Tennessee Ernie Ford. I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for no good pay. So I can sit out here and waste my life away, drag back home and drown my troubles away. It's a darn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me and people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is. Living in the new world with an old soul, those rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just want to have total control. Want to know what you think, want to know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, because your dollar ain't much. And it's taxed to no end because of rich men north of Richmond. I have a question for you today. Anybody want to take a guess at what percentage of people that own their own businesses are working 12 hours on a weekend? How many people who own their own houses are working every Sunday? You know what the answer to that is? Less than one. This is what we've created in our country. September of 2020, I know that I bought a house then. If you got a $400,000 loan, and you could get it at historically low rates, you could even get it lower than that, but I'm just saying that's standard at the time. If you paid back that loan over the course of 30 years, you would pay back $569,069. You would pay that for a $400,000 house. Just 3 years later. If you get that same $400,000 loan, now the rates are 7.9%. And if you, a working family, have to pay that loan back at this percentage rate, this is what you're paying for that house. But here's what we all know. Can you buy the same house in Murfreesboro for $400,000 that you could 3 years ago? So now you don't need a $400,000 loan for the same house. You probably need $600,000 loan, but I'm just conservatively going to say, I ran these numbers by George, one of our real estate agents, like $550,000 loan today. That's the same house that we had. Now you'll pay over 30 years $1.5 million for the same house you could have bought 3 years ago. For that. Listen, we got to ask these questions. Where's all that money going? Now, I know this, I can't say it, especially out loud, but I know it 100% for a fact to be true. Everybody in Congress knew when we dropped the rates to this, that the house that cost this would soon cost that. And so the people who were on the inside, they went around and they just started buying up land. People in Congress, representatives all over the country, those who were affluent and knew the people who were making the laws. Listen, did you know that in the United States, there are 100 families that own 2% of the public land? Now, you say, well, that's not much, 2%. It is when 100 families are of the 300 million that live in this country. And the land that they own, listen, those 100 families, the land that they own, over the last 10 years, they own 300% more of our nation's land. They've tripled their land ownership versus 2013. What they did is they went out. Now, track here, you got to understand this. They went out and they bought up all the land they could at this rate, and now they're turning around and selling it at this rate. They're making money. And then all the banks and the investors are making that extra $1 million on every family in the country who's going out to get a loan right now. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? And so now everybody that's borrowing, what does the Bible say? The borrowers are slaves to who? The lenders. And my friends, listen, we've got a country full of slaves. And we're all contributing to the slaves working on Sundays. Where does this end? What do we do? Why do we give out all this free money? Where did all that stimulus money come from that now a lot of people are having to pay back? Where did it come from? It was our money. Do you understand, my friends? The number one landowner in America is the United States government. They own more land than all those 100 families. They are Pharaoh. You give out all this free money. You drop the interest rates. Everybody with money, buy stuff right now. Then you sell it at 30% more, and now everybody else, if they want a piece of the pie, you got to pay triple what you had to pay for it 3 years ago. If you're in your 20s or 30s, man, trying to buy a home right now, good luck. Artificially driving up costs, food prices. No one could get around that. How's this going to end? Well, it's the same way it always does. You're going to have four-income families, child labor. Kids are going to have to get jobs again. Government oppression and a slave class. That's one way it can end, or there's another, a political revolution. And it can be a soft one like we saw early in the 20th century, or it can be a hard one like we saw in the 1700s and 1800s. I want to close with this. I'm just going to read it to you because just like 2020, man, you got to measure every word you say. A few months ago, I did a mini sermon series entitled Living in Corinth, Strangers in Babylon. I wrote it and delivered it in response to some national retailers making clear overtures supporting and encouraging LGBTQ lifestyles. The backlash against some of these retailers was significant, forcing many of their companies' stock to drop by double digits. In many ways, Americans were not ready for what was perceived as an attack on their children and the values that the companies were advocating. I personally think much of the backlash was due to the in-your-face nature of the advertising, and it was as if people woke up from Rip Van Winkle's dream and realized that they're not in 2014 Kansas anymore. Our culture has changed so rapidly since this legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015 that it's resulted in many people not even recognizing the culture that we live in today. For many of those over the age of 40, it feels like our nation has been taken captive, and the values of a society that used to exist, those values are now long in the past. But I'm here to share something with you today. There is something far more dangerous going on in our nation than the LGBTQ culture wars that are dividing us today. Oftentimes we can read biblical history like it's a collection of just moralisms. And while there are moral lessons to learn from Scripture, there are also political ones. And starting this upcoming Sunday, we're going to look at a politically involved young man and his friends who were integrated in politics at the highest levels. We've already looked at one, Joseph, and how he instituted a taxation process that ultimately saved much of the known world. Listen, and it worked as long as Joseph, a moral man, was in charge of it. God had communicated through dreams to Pharaoh as opposed to speaking directly to Pharaoh to ensure that people who fear God had to be included in the governmental process. So while Joseph was there, the government operated ultimately in a way that was best for all. But what the Bible teaches us is once God's representatives are taken out of the way, the government's power to rule will begin to be abused. And what the Bible teaches us again and again is that unless political power is tempered by a fear of God, it will always result in the subjugation of personal freedoms, especially economic and religious freedom. So what do we do when we see governments abusing their power? Well, in most cases, people feel helpless, and they are consequently prone to turn to violence or other unseemly means to maintain their freedoms or their economic prosperity. For some groups that feel subjugated, it leads to things like looting in our cities. For others, it looks like a mob on January 6th at the Capitol building. One of the things that biblical history teaches us, and history in general, is that it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Right now, what we are seeing is rampant economic pressure being utilized to silence God's people. And whenever you see that, you can be sure that political force and the rule of law will not be far behind. Like what we saw in Egypt, in Nazi Germany, or even here in the United States, when religious leaders cease to be the keepers of human dignity and heralds of God's justice, governments will abuse the powers given to them. And unless there is divine intervention, at a certain point, some government entity with a gun will show up at your house, compelling you to acquiesce to their political dictates. And when we see that begin to happen, where must God's people stand up and refuse to bow the knee? We've got to equip these people in the front rows for these days that are coming. Like Joseph, there's another teenager interpreter of dreams who will give us our cues. In the book of Daniel, we will see 4 young men who, through the sovereign will of God, find themselves at odds with the most powerful government in the world. And in some situations, they capitulate. In others, they negotiate. But in some, they refuse to be subordinate to a culture that demands their participation in direct affronts to the worship of God and the distortion of justice toward the marginalized and the oppressed. Why, as God people, do we, as followers of Jesus, have to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves? Why? Because that's what Jesus did for us. We had no chance towards spiritual prosperity apart from the God-man coming down and being crucified on our behalf to provide not just spiritual prosperity, but to renew God's call through the Torah to set free the oppressed, to release the prisoner, to unbind the chains of those who are held down by those with political power. And if we're going to call ourselves followers of Christ, we don't just do like Joseph did for his people and take care of us and our own. We have to be like the people during the Civil War. We have to be like the leaders during the Civil Rights era, to stand up and refuse to bow the knee before a government who has forgot who they are supposed to be. And that is not our leaders, but our representatives. It's our job as the people of God to lead them. They don't lead us.